group of folks that are joining us for this dialogue. And we're hoping one of the other speakers will be joining us. Hopefully will be joining us soon, M. Adams, who's the co-executive director of Freedom Inc. But with us right now, we have and invite you all to welcome to this group two distinguished colleagues and amazing folks. Bree Rivera, who's a program fellow with the Black Trans Fund, and David Johns, who's the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. And of course, we have April, who's with us from Funders. And so just give them snaps, applause, however you want to just give them shouts in the chat. We know the chat is always a good place for us to just talk about folks and talk to folks and connect. So why don't we dive into this discussion? And because it's an important and timely conversation, as race has definitely been a conversation that an issue that's been just percolating all over the place. I want to invite you to hear first from our colleagues and the folks that are joining us for this dialogue. And if you could start, Bree, tell us who you are, talk a little bit about your work and what you hope to bring into this dialogue today.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Bree Rivera. I use she, her pronouns. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I am the program officer of the Black Trans Fund, which is a new fund explicitly for Black transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary folks that's being incubated by Groundswell Fund. Super excited to join you all today and talk about all of the exciting things that are happening at BTF. Just to kind of orient folks on how I got into philanthropy, I ran a grassroots nonprofit organization in Detroit called the Trans Sister of Color. And actually my shift into philanthropy happened just because we were not well resourced, right? As a Black trans woman, I did all of the fundraising, moving all the money to the field, right? But just really wanting to name that anti-Blackness and lack of trust of Black trans communities actually drove me out of that job. And so I moved into philanthropy with the goal of starting a fund explicitly for Black trans folks, right? Not only to move money to the field, but Black Trans Fund is different because we actually center joy and liberation in Black trans communities. We know that in the field, there are tons of stories about like the violence and discrimination that trans folks face, right? But I decided that it wasn't just important to build a fund, right? But a fund that actually like talked about our lives in ways that were actually like meaningful. So our grants not only help build movement and help build like the leadership of Black trans folks, but it also like really centers like joy and liberation. So everything that we talk about is like centered in that. And it's important in this moment in this country with the pandemic and all the violence that's happening. Really wanting to shift the narrative to joy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Bree. David, we go way back, brother. I'm just, thrilled to see you in the space that you are in, have been navigating an interesting and important national conversation in space. And so talk to us a little bit more about the National Black Justice Coalition and your thoughts and how you bring this discussion into your, appreciation for the work, but then also this challenge that we're talking about when we're getting to talk about philanthropy, supporting Black-led work in these intersectional moments.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you, Ed, and super excited to be in community with Bree and M when they are able to join us as well. For folks who do not know, my name is David Johns, as was mentioned. I have the pleasure of quarterbacking the team at the National Black Justice Coalition. We're the nation's oldest civil rights organization that has remained both intentional and unapologetic, and acknowledging that as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black, trans, queer, and non-binary people, and the path to freedom or liberation or justice or joy or any of the things connected to this moment and the movement for Black lives requires us to understand that and respond in ways that celebrate that. And so specific to your question, Edward, about what I'm hoping to get out of this conversation, there are some funders who might not know that I am in this role. They might remember me having led the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans for still my President Barack Hussein Obama, and the smartest person that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting, his wife, Michelle Yvonne Robinson Obama. And my challenge that existed then in that role remains a challenge that I have now in my role at NBJC. And so I really want to encourage us to be honest with each other, to tell ourselves and one another the truth. For far too long, I have been invited into spaces, including with leaders in philanthropy who purport to care about racial justice and who really want to fund work connected to the Black Lives Matter movement. And if we purport to care about Black lives, we have to care about, and in this moment, we have to be intentional in centering the leadership of and needs of Black, queer, trans, and non-binary organizations and communities. And what I am mindful of is there is a graphic that was shared, shout out to everyone who was responsible for producing it at Funders for LGBTQ issues, as well as AFBI, and the top priorities with regard to the needs addressing children in poverty, anti-discrimination, HIV, and police violence have been the priorities for the National Black Justice Coalition since inception. Similarly, when we think about the areas or the opportunities around advocacy, health and well-being, and civil rights, those remain our priorities. And so I really want to highlight that members of our community, present and past, I think often about the work of Marsha P. Johnson, who is very much connected to current conversations around things like the Equality Act and contemporary efforts to advance anti-discrimination policy. It's members of our communities who are often on the front line and are not often invited into rooms and at tables and in conversations with funders to talk about investing in our work in ways that are both meaningful and measurable and don't require us to spend the time that we otherwise should be engaging in the work, fulfilling reporting requirements that don't always align with, again, the mission and the goals that we say we agree upon. So I hope that we can be honest with each other, and I hope that we can be a conduit to funders who want to invest more in Black, queer, trans, and non-binary organizations and leaders.
Thank you. Thank you. And David, thank you for lifting up honesty and truth, because we know we've not had a lot of that lately in the political world. So we need to be more honest with each other. And so appreciate you lifting that. Em, it is good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Talk to us a little bit about who you are, who you with, and really what you're bringing into this dialogue.
Great. So, hey, everybody. Apologies for being a few minutes late. I have shaky internet here, but I think I resolved it. My gender pronouns are she and her, he and him, they and them, pretty much anything said respectfully. I am co-executive director of an organization called Freedom Inc., based in Madison, Wisconsin, where we focus on ending violence within and against low-income Black and Southeast Asian communities. And we define violence on the spectrum. So we do work around sexual violence, intimate partner violence, to police terrorism, white supremacy, capitalism, et cetera. And our efforts focus on women and girls, queer, trans, and intersex folks within those communities. I also am one of the leadership team members of the Movement for Black Lives, which is an ecosystem of over 160 Black-led organizations in the country who are all joined together in our mission, or in our objectives rather, to build a abolitionist, anti-capitalist, Black, queer, feminist future and world. And so I enter this conversation as a movement builder. I enter this conversation as a person who has built important Black radical queer projects over the last years, both, those projects greatly or significantly underfunded. And I also come into this conversation as someone who has built movement on a national and a transnational level. And so what I hope to offer here is to help us identify what some of those gaps are and even pose some solutions around it. And I also think, just building on some of the former conversations we've had as panelists, but really to hold, to hold us to the fire a bit, to really ensure, or to really create movement into the direction of making sure that we don't continue to have a conversation around how Black, queer, trans, intersex organizations and groups are underfunded, but rather we move to a place of action where next time we convene, we can talk about how great we funded Black, queer, trans, and intersex organizing and projects. And also here just to really demonstrate how critical Black, queer, trans, intersex organizing is to liberation, all liberation work. I can't think of a single issue from immigration to domestic violence to climate justice, police. I can't think of a single issue where Black, queer, trans, intersex folks are not leading and are not kicking ass. So also wanted to offer that. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. I see that little emoji up there, Bree. Yes, right. Yeah, we're not single issue people. So in that spirit of that, this is an important dialogue. And thank you for bringing all that you bring into the dialogue. And so I want to pivot to April Bethea with the funders, because you all released a report that has triggered a lot of dialogue. It should trigger even more. It should obviously compel resources to shift. But could you talk a little bit about how, like, the origin story of the report, this infographic that shows just a miserable philanthropic response to supporting Black folks, Black-led LGBTQ organizations. So talk a little bit about that and who you are, of course, April, because I know you, but I want everyone else to know you too.
Yeah, hi. So April here. I want to flag one thing real quick that has come up in the comments a few times. Our captioner today fell through. We are really big on disability justice here at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. And so anyone on the call who is in need of captions, we are going to record this and those captions will be added and we will send that video out for anyone who is in need of those. So I just wanted to flag that. We are here today and to be a part of this conversation, but also to celebrate the coming out, if you will, of our Black LGBTQ communities infographic. We released this right before the election. And so I don't know about you, but big time in my life, probably a big time in your life. So we want to restart that conversation and really bring it to it here and really present the data that we have collected. This infographic was a long time coming. It's something that we've been talking about doing for years with AppV. It's something that was important to our work, but it's something that became imperative to our work this summer. It's something that when we thought about the uprisings that happened around the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Tony McDade, the economic downturn we're facing because of COVID, the increasing reality of COVID-19, which, as we know, impacts Black and Brown communities disproportionately, the want to look at this data became a need to look at this data. And so this is a project that we've put a lot of ourselves into this year, and it's a project that we're committed to continuing and looking at this data over time going forward. I'm going to walk us through that a bit if you'll have me. So again, my name is April Bethea. I am the Membership and Development Associate here at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. I know many of you are familiar with our work, but it's really my job today to ground us in context, both in terms of institution and data. So I want to take a second to familiarize everyone with the work of Funders for LGBTQ Issues, specifically to provide context on our research and the infographic that brings us together today. Funders for LGBTQ Issues works to increase the scale and impact of philanthropic resources aimed at enhancing the well-being of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer communities, promoting equity and advancing racial, economic, and gender justice. We do this in three primary ways: convenings and collective action, outreach and support services, and research and communications. As I mentioned, I'm here today putting on a research and communications hat, but I primarily work in the development space. And I wanted to speak to that real quick. I'm at once here as a co-author of our LGBTQ Black communities infographic, but also as a way to engage our members on funding opportunities that we think are essential in this moment. Both funders and our partners at AppV are membership networks. And so I just want to underscore that this work we do is to support what our members are able to move forward for us in the sector. Something that's particularly important as we think about the intersections at play in funding, right? As a Black queer woman, I'm grateful to be able to present this data to both the networks of Funders for LGBTQ Issues and AppV today. I'm also grateful to the nonprofit leaders and movement organizers who have joined us to watch this presentation today. We were happy on October 21st to finally get to release this project. obviously, again, right before a big election. So if you haven't gotten a chance to look at this infographic yet, that's totally fine. That's why we're here. We're really going to look at this resource together before we kick it back over to the panelists and then to get bigger picture with them. This infographic would not have been possible without our friends at AbbVie, so I just want to take a second to thank them, especially our moderator today, Edward Jones, and Program Associate Takesha Morgan, who I believe is watching alongside us. I also want to thank my collaborators on this project, Andrew Wallace and Lyle Matthew Kahn, and everyone else on the funders team that supported this work from editing to outreach and beyond. I think we're going to go to the next slide, if that's all right, Andrew. And the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, one of our primary contributions to the field is research and communications. And if you've attended any of our presentations before, you've likely seen this slide. We love this slide primarily because it does a lot of work to highlight the data set that we're working with. Each year, funders collect grant-making data from US-based foundations and corporations in order to track trends, gaps, opportunities, and change over time. Because of this work, we've accumulated a very unique data set that covers LGBTQ funding from the early 1970s, as you can see, to 2018, which was our most recent tracking report. Looking at funds trends over time is a helpful place to start. For instance, we know COVID-19 has brought with it an economic downturn, and we don't know how long it's going to last. But we do have data on the impact of financial contradictions in the past. And if we look at the chart here, we can see the severe dip in funding following the 2008 financial crisis. We also know that funding for already marginalized issues, including LGBTQ issues, have been disproportionately impacted by economic downturns in the past. While these losses were recovered in subsequent years since the recession, we have to keep these increases in context and note that funding for LGBTQ issues only surpassed a non-causal 200 million in 2018. This number is a big deal. It's a stat we've been looking for a long time. It's no small feat, but in the grand scheme of things in foundation funding, it's a pretty small number. Even at that record high of 209.2 million we saw in 2018, only 28 cents of every $100 awarded by US-based foundations specifically supported LGBTQ communities. And of that, LGBTQ Black communities have never received more than 5%. Given reporting as it stands, we won't have data on how COVID has impacted funding for LGBTQ issues until late next year. But knowing that the trends that are the way that they are, it's important for us to stay vigilant. Next slide, please. In our recent infographic produced with AbbVie, we take a closer look at funding specifically focused on LGBTQ Black communities. When looking at the specific funding, though, we find that while grant dollars for Black LGBTQ communities have increased over the past decade, reaching a record high in 2018, funding has never exceeded more than 7.5 million a year, or no more than 5% of all LGBTQ funding. But if we want to break it down a little further, in 2018, that was less than 0.01% of all foundation funding, which could speak for itself, but let's break that down a little bit more. There are a lot of ways we could break down the need for Black LGBTQ communities, but even if we were to do a direct population comparison, the underfunding is apparent. There are nearly 1.4 million Black LGBTQ adults in the United States, which totals 12% of the LGBTQ population, or the equivalent of the entire population of Dallas, Texas, meaning that 5% of all LGBTQ funding doesn't adequately address the need. And if we break that down further by subpopulation, the underfunding is more damning, right? Black, trans, and gender nonconforming people collectively received less than 1% of all funding for LGBTQ issues in 2018. That does not adequately respond to need. And as we'll discuss on the next slide, the actual breakdown of this underfunding to Black LGBTQ communities is top heavy. So at 7.5 million, Black LGBTQ funding is subject to the whims of funders. And we're in a time where we can't predict the ebbs and flows of those whims. If we look at the top 10 funders of Black LGBTQ issues between 2017 and 2018, the list is particularly top heavy. If we look at this, right, and Ford decided to cut their grants to Black LGBTQ communities, there'd be a serious impact because we know that the top 10 funders of Black LGBTQ communities accounted for 65% of all funding to Black LGBTQ communities during this 2-year period. We also know that 2 of these funders or pharmaceutical companies whose grant making focuses almost exclusively on HIV/AIDS. If we include Elton John AIDS Foundation in that, then 3 of the top 5 funders of Black LGBTQ communities are funding primarily HIV/AIDS work. While this work is super important, we also know that to build sustainable movements, we need funding streams that embrace the diversity of our movements, the unique needs of our movements. We need holistic funding and sustained investment in Black communities. It's also worth noting that all of these funders are national funders, meaning we're seeing less inherent investment in local communities from top funders. As many on this call know, investment in local communities builds movement work, not the other way around. And as I know we'll talk about in the panel shortly, money for capacity building, leadership development on the ground is needed. With that in mind, I want to conclude this presentation by talking about the breakdown of funding for Black LGBTQ communities along strategy and issue areas, which we'll see on the next slide. So what kind of Black LGBTQ organizations receive funding? Our research shows that advocacy organizations received almost half of all funding for Black LGBTQ communities, followed by service providers. We wanted to compare this data here with the data we have on funding for all LGBTQ communities, and we found that the breakdown is largely similar along strategy lines. Where it's a bit more interesting is within issue areas. Black LGBTQ communities received 42% of their funding for health and well-being. This is a 20% higher share than all LGBTQ communities broadly. And when we break that down further, we see that health centers and organizations providing support related to HIV/AIDS received nearly 3/4 of all funding directed to service providers. We also know that over half of all funding intended for Black LGBTQ communities was awarded to non-LGBTQ organizations for specific programmatic support. This includes funding to HIV/AIDS service providers that have a mandate to serve a broad community, as well as national racial justice organizations like the NAACP. As we mentioned earlier, there is a need for both holistic funding and sustained investment in Black communities, and we needed to support grassroots funders and not just national funders, especially in a time where we don't know if we can count on health and well-being funding given this moment. And then on the flip side of that, we're in a moment where we had a summer of uprisings. We had an election that largely went the way it did because of Black organizing and Black voter turnout, specifically the turnout of Black women. And a lot of that organizing we know to be queer, right? Em said it in their introduction earlier. We're in a moment where mutual aid is in common parlance, but it's not new to Black LGBTQ communities. And we can't let this moment go by with the groundswell of support that dries up next year. We have to invest in Black LGBTQ communities for long-term sustainability. And that might mean upsetting some common funding practices, but if the time is not now, when is it? I know that tracking this funding long-term is something that's on the minds of both of us, both here at funders and on the minds of our partners at AbbVie. I'm sure that's why Edward asked me that question at the top of this, right? And as we see increased commitments in philanthropy and beyond, we know it's important to monitor how much of any new funding entering the field is supporting projects and organizations by and for Black people, Black LGBTQ people in particular, and Black trans people specifically. There are so many opportunities for analysis. It's ripe for analysis, specifically for further analysis on funding to Black trans issues and organizations. We know that Black trans and gender nonconforming people, again, collectively received less than 1% of all funding for LGBTQ issues in 2018. And while we've seen this funding increasing, we also know it's not increasing fast enough for need in a moment where Black trans women are being murdered. We are lucky enough to have Bree Rivera on our panel today, who I'm sure will talk about the challenges of building a new fund for Black trans folks in the sector. And because I know we have a panel here with more wisdom than data alone can offer, I'm gonna pass it back over to them. But I'm happy to talk more about the infographic and our recommendations to funders in the Q&A portion later. Any questions you have about data or any questions you have in the panel discussion, please drop in the comments and we'll come back to them. Thank you so much.
April, thank you as well. You know, every time I've seen or heard the data regarding funding for Black organizations, it just, my blood pressure goes up. And of course, that's not a good thing for Black folks, right? Having, you know, blood pressure issues. But it's just stunning to see just how, you know, these numbers translate their lives that are impacted by the lack of support. Yet we persist. These folks that are speaking on this panel get to the heart of how and why we persist in spite of being overlooked for funding. I'll just quickly say I serve on the board of an organization called Us Helping Us People into Living, which is a 30-plus-year-old organization. I know some of my colleagues, including the board chairs on this call, and I posted a link to it in the chat. That group, had it not been for funders, particularly those that are in the big pharma and in government agencies, they've sustained this organization for the better part of the 30 years of its existence. And it's been primarily focused on Black men, HIV/AIDS prevention and support, just, wraparound services in so many different levels. And it's expanded to trans and other women and people of color in a space and a time where these organizations were not even given the support. All the attention was paid in the beginning of the AIDS crisis to particularly white gay men, right? That history has shown up in so many different ways. And now we look at where we are today, and we're still seeing this woefully inequitable funding strategy. And these folks, I can't emphasize enough the tenacity that you all have shared. And I want you to really talk, and I'll start with you, Bree, to talk a little bit more about the struggle that you face in this space, kind of having what some would consider strikes against you, being Black, being queer, being trans. I mean, however we've identified in these spaces, oftentimes it's exacerbated. The real oversight or lack of support is exacerbated by our identities. And so you're building this new fund, Bree, and your fund is to support others that are like you, others that need the support in a climate that has not been very Black friendly. And I'm saying that nicely. Could you talk a little bit more about your challenges with this? And then also talk a little bit also too about the hope that you had. What's kept you persistently focusing on this work?
Say it nicely. Yeah, so I am glad that I had enough knowledge and vision to be able to center a fund around joy and liberation. This year has been one of the hardest years for me as someone who's been a movement leader. Yeah, and so really wanting to name that, like, this conversation is really hard because there's a lot of feelings that are bubbling up. I've been ignored, lied on, lied to, folks have stolen resources, folks didn't trust us, folks worked around me, like all of these things, right? And so it was my goal in creating this fund and actually like trying to counteract that culture. And so for me, joy and liberation means providing communities with joy, right? And so for me, that means small grants leave little room for joy, right? So Black Trans Fund was created as a fund that actually like gives folks meaningful grants to move their work, right? And we also pay fiscal sponsor fees because we know that a lot of our groups are actually being shortchanged on the amount of funds that they are able to use to support communities because of fiscal sponsor fees, right? We know that fiscal sponsors are important to help with the capacity building and the health of organizations, right? But in this moment, we felt like it was inappropriate to give out grants and then charge folks a tax to then receive those grants, right? And then just wanting to name that, like, for me, one of the things that has been most liberating in my experience as being an advocate was actually having folks that saw me as a full person and actually pumped resources into me when I needed them most. I'm very clear that I don't want visibility. I really honestly do not care if folks see me, right? And I think that that has been one of the things that philanthropy has focused on, right? Giving folks money, visibility, right? We want to like highlight your orgs, but I think there is another piece that needs to happen in order to build strong, sustainable organizations, and capacity building is a big piece of that. In my 16 years of being a movement leader, I think it's really telling that I have dedicated so much time, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into a movement that doesn't still trust me, right? And so for me, leading, it's hard talking about it because I understand that Black Trans Fund is in this unique position of resourcing folks in this way. But there have been tons of organizations that have been resourcing folks since before Black Trans Fund existed. Perfect example, Black Trans Travel Fund, right? Small fund in New York City, moving money, $300,000 and more to folks to like help with travel, right? That's a small piece of like providing joy and liberation for communities, right? But it stops violence, right? And it makes sure that folks actually have a safe way to move around. And so Black Trans Fund wants to support groups like that, right? But also wants to like support these organizations that are new and emerging, right? Because that's important. And I'm just really wanting to name really quickly that for me, my joy comes from moving the grants, talking to the folks on the ground, you know, shifting resources. And for me, being able to have a fund that's centered in joy, where I get to like hear all of these like amazing stories and support folks' work, has actually kept me grounded in a field that does not see me as someone who is powerful. And that is so annoying and so heartbreaking, that as a leader of a fund that is funding Black trans community, that I have to do dancing, talking, convincing, right? When a majority of the funds that I'm talking about get to like position themselves as folks who support Black trans communities, and that's not always true, right? And so really wanting to encourage folks to think about actually what you're doing when you're supporting Black trans-led organizations. And so for us, we figured that that threshold is 75% of the organization being Black trans leadership, right? We've seen in the past where organizations have like one Black person on staff, right, or a couple, and they get to position themselves to get resources that actually belong to Black trans communities, right? And so really wanting folks to be more thoughtful about the amount of labor that they're asking folks to put in to get grants and to move money to the field, right? But then also asking folks to check their own biases around liberation and joy for Black trans communities, being very clear that the direct service work and the mutual aid work that Black trans communities have been providing to folks for years have not been funded. And it wasn't not funded because because of capacity or like smaller issues. Folks felt like Black trans folks didn't deserve to have their rent paid, to get a ride to the airport, right? To have food in their homes, right? And so philanthropy actually has to take a real step back and assessment on how we have failed Black trans communities. And now is the moment for us to actually reconcile some of those traumas and some of the harm that we've caused, and actually pumping more money into Black trans communities.
Yeah. I should have warned everyone, this is going to be a Tuesday sermon. You're going to hear some folks that are going to be preaching to you today, so just be ready. And then at the end of this, we will have an offering. So just be ready to also do that as well. Thank you so much, Bree. You really lift up so many important statements in what you shared, thinking about this lack of trust that seems to permeate in this field, not trusting the people to do the work. I'm going to post on the chat just a report that we did, that AFI did around what we call redlining by another name, around getting folks to fund Black-led social change. And so these stories that we're hearing about how Black-led LGBTQ groups are being underfunded, it's throughout Black-led organizations, irrespective of identity. It's a situation, it's a problem. And then the other side of that, though, is we're the first ones being called upon to get more people at the polling places, right? The ones that get stories out to communities and our folks. So there's truly a disconnect to that. And I think your work and the Freedom Inc., the work that you all do, I mean, you again are representing more than any one issue and one identity. And it's so important for us to really understand the intersection of this work, which is actually at the heart of this conversation too, that we are talking about really broader coalition building, strengthening ways in which we work better together. And so I'd love for you to dig a little bit deeper into that. And I would definitely invite you. I was going to use Ashley's quote to start this off, but I know you won't bring it in here because I think that's the important piece of that. So talk about that quote that we know is a powerful one that tells the story of what we really need funders to do.
Right on. So a very good friend of mine, she's actually one of my best friends, but just an incredible movement leader, a North Star for me and for many others, Ashley Woodard Henderson, the first Black woman executive director of the Highlander Center, she always says, fund us like you want us to win. And so oftentimes when movement leaders and movement organizations when we are tasked or burdened with being able to, or having to demonstrate why our organizations or movements should be resourced, we often find ourselves asking for far less than what it actually costs, right? So if the question funders thought that they were addressing, I think, was how much does Black liberation cost? Or how much does trans liberation cost? Or even how much does racial equity, racial justice cost? That is a very different set of questions than how much for your program. And so we need to be funded and resourced as though people have the confidence and the trust to build off of what Bree said, for us to do the work and for us to lead and win. And so the evidence is there. I think if we were just to do a brief historic review of just the last months of this year, I think the amount of visionary work, thought labor, thought leadership, strategic planning and execution of movement driven and led by Black, queer, trans, and intersex folks has been remarkable, to say the least. I think even right now, how the funding world and the broader society are debating the merit of defund the police. That was started and developed, that thinking of how to intervene around policy, maintaining an abolitionist politic and having a Black queer feminist lens to say how we approach it in police violence and terrorism. That was led by Black, queer, trans, and intersex folks and driven by the rebellion in Minneapolis, led by a Black, queer, trans collective called Black Visions Lab. And so that is just an example of how something created, developed, led, and executed by incredible Black QTI leadership is now something that is benefiting the country. And so that is the thing I think people often miss about the work that Black, queer, trans, intersex folks that we are leading and driving, is that what we fight for and what we build benefits everybody. Even if we're saying, fighting for Black lives, the result of that, the consequence of that movement will benefit all people. And so we should be resourced as, certainly as Black folks, but we should be resourced as broad movement leaders as well. And so I think about looking at this infographic and looking at the data presented, absolutely 100%. I think LGBTQ funders need to better resource Black movements and Black queer folks. But I think more broadly, all movements need to better resource Black queer leadership as we're driving on every issue, from food, from climate, from housing. I can't, again, as I stated earlier, I can't think of a single sector in which there aren't Black, queer, trans, intersex folks leading and doing that incredible work. And then the last thing I'll say here quickly, before I kick it back to you, is what I think is so important about this moment is that we have an opportunity to define where we go next, the broader we. So Arundhati Roy, who's an Indian writer, says that pandemics are a portal. So we're inside of several pandemics. There's the COVID-19 pandemic, but as Black folks, we still dealing with the pandemic of 1619, right? Of transatlantic enslavement, of anti-Blackness, et cetera. We have an opportunity to define where we can go. We have an opportunity as a broader we to say what it is that is possible and to build and to go into the next portal together. And so I think this moment is incredibly inspiring because in some sense, our ancestors and folks before us have faced similar issues and have won, right? So my ancestors have defeated chattel enslavement, have defeated Jim Crow, have defeated redlining and particular variations. So that inspires me to know that we can defeat this current iteration of institutions, that we have that incredible organizing legacy. What is also inspiring about this moment is we've never been in this exact moment before. And that means we get to learn the lessons and not repeat the mistakes of the past. And so I think this is an opportunity for philanthropy to no longer see themselves as something separate from movement or distant from movement or observing the movement, but to see themselves as part of movement. So we are not looking for folks with resources to come to us from a paternalistic posturing of I have money, Black person or gay person, here's what I want to give you. But instead, we want people to understand that this is a call of investment. And frankly, and proportionately speaking, philanthropy can never match the investment and movement that Black people have, right? Philanthropy can never match the investment that queer, trans, intersex Black folks have, right? We have folks who are homeless giving their last meal to create a group meeting. We have folks who are underemployed, unemployed, still donating with doing grassroots organizing, grassroots fundraising for one another. We have folks opening their doors to one another to create real-time alternatives to homelessness through providing direct housing. And so I'm saying that to say that the charge given to philanthropy isn't one that we haven't met 100 times over. And that is to take seriously the true cost of movement building and to invest in it in a serious way, as though philanthropy knows that we will win.
Mm-hmm. This is the time when the organist comes in and starts hitting those chords, right? Saying this is some good word right here. Thank you so much, for lifting that up. Yes, Cedric, that's exactly right. Clapping at all of it. And you touch on so many important areas here. We talk about, at ABFE, the importance of, when we do our work around effective and responsive philanthropy for Black communities, we really center on this need for folks to start disaggregating that data, right? Start talking about specific. If you're looking to respond to a specific issue, then you should be looking at specific data. You should be looking at specific people and looking to them for the answers to give you guidance on what you're doing. And so often when we're talking about issues of justice, folks want to think that there's a one size fits all approach, right? There's been a lot of money that's been put out there in social media and folks' platforms around addressing this moment, this racism pandemic, as the Association of Psychological, the American Psychological Association has called it. It's a pandemic. This racism is a pandemic that you don't hear people clamoring, beating down trees and paying high dollars to researchers to support eradicating it like you're seeing for these issues of this COVID-19 pandemic. And I look at you, David, with your mask on, and I think about the folks that have been in these streets with masks on, fighting for justice, but they've been told and they've listened to the experts that we needed to address this issue of this pandemic that is decimating our households and our families and communities, and has created so much discord on a global scale. When you get to talking about this issue, David, of the Black Justice Coalition, I know the liberation that you speak of really has tentacles that reach so many more folks. And so could you talk about this vision of the work and what really needs to be happening in this moment? Because you've been in a working, coherent administration. You've been in that space before. So we can see, you can definitely parallel what's worked then and what's not working right now. So in the spirit of what you look like, in the aftermath of an election that still seems to be going on, it's like the longest election we've experienced. Could you talk about your justice work and the organization's work and your strategies and thoughts around where we are today and where we need to be tomorrow?
Yes, I can. And before I do that, I just want to name how inspired I am to be in the company of my colleagues who do this work and who show up and show out, even when they don't have invitations to do so in places like this. I also want to name that I'm in a public space in my building because COVID. And so folks that are dealing with their children, the young baby buses, and pets and other things that are going on, this is where we are. So just want to name those two things. I think my responses to your question, Edward, are one, to talk about how excited I am to have welcomed recently to the team Victoria Kirby York as our deputy director. She's in the chat dropping knowledge. I feel like we get to tag team because she's making points in the chat that I very much agree with, as well as Dr. Kia Darling Hammond to our team to lead our education program and research work. And Kia's work is seminal and as a response to this question because she centers thriving, much like Bree talks about joy and the importance of joy in the pursuit of liberation for diverse and beautifully diverse Black bodies. We talk about the importance of thriving, not just doing enough so that we can show up, not telling us to cope and adopt additional strategies, bend ourselves into positions that were never designed for us to fit in, but to talk about funding us in ways that allow us to thrive holistically. And that has always been at the center of our work. And at the same time, we've also highlighted, to M's point, the uniqueness of the diverse needs of members within our community. And so this is a moment when we have to walk and chew gum at the same time, because there's a lot of work to be done. And we know that the lessons that exist, as M has already talked about, are that if we invest in Black, queer, trans, and non-binary leadership, we know we can win. As M was talking, I was thinking about the fact that we would not have anything associated with queer wins if it were not for Marsha P. Johnson and the work that she still doesn't get credit for with organizing STAR. We would not be talking about this particular moment in the global movement for Black lives if it were not for Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people in particular. Dr. Marcus Anthony Hunter, the UCLA professor, who was the first person to use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and 3 Black women, 2 of whom identify as queer, who led the organization that popularized the work that had already been being done in communities throughout the country prior to that point. And in particular, when I think about the work going forward, when you talked about, still my administration, the Obama-Biden administration, we should be clear that there was a lot of work to be done then. There is still undone work when it comes to protecting the rights of, advancing anti-discrimination policies for, and otherwise improving life outcomes and opportunities for Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people. And I celebrate the work that has been done there. And we should all be clear that in the Biden-Harris administration, there's still a lot of work for us to be done. I need everyone who can hear me now and who will access this later to understand that anything connected to anti-discrimination policies or the Equality Act, anything that is anchored in addressing things associated with the Black Lives Matter movement or anti-discrimination policies that disproportionately benefit women, white women, before they benefit members of our community, require investments in the leadership of and organizations led by Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people. To M's point, we are best suited to advance messaging, strategy, everything connected to the apparatus of developing, implementing policy. We are best suited to do so in ways that benefit everyone else. The lesson we get from critical race theory, right? People talk about intersectionality. Sometimes people give credit to Kimberly Crenshaw. Seldom do people acknowledge that Patricia Hill Collins reminds us that intersectionality was a practice that Indigenous women throughout the diaspora used to shift praxis, the space where policy meets practice. And I think sometimes we have the luxury of just thinking about things and resting in theory and pontificating about the change that we would like to see. And my hope is that we leverage the urgency of now to move toward more action, and that action has to center those of us who know best how to do this work in ways that will benefit everyone else.
Indeed, indeed. And so critical to that your points is this notion of folks getting very comfortable with seeing a small win that may seem to be big, but at the end of the day, the work hasn't, ended. The battle hasn't ended. So you can celebrate.
I want to push you on that. I want to push you on that, because I think that this is a point that Victoria made in the chat, which is that, like, I want to acknowledge that often funders get stuck in this space of not knowing and then not doing.
Yeah.
And what I want to say to you is that, like, that's fine and that's okay, but you need to trust us.
Yes.
And so spend less time visioning what you think it is that we should be doing, and trust that, like, we already know because we're doing the work.
Yes.
We were at AFBI some years ago when I was on a panel, an opening plenary, and I'll never forget this. One of our colleagues from the continent, I think she was from South Africa, asked, like, what kind of a RFP or invitation letter would y'all have asked Dr. King to have submitted to fund the movement? Right, before it was the actual movement. What I'm saying in this moment is again, coloring the point that M made. The work that we do sometimes doesn't make sense to y'all, and it shouldn't, because it is radical by nature. What we are doing is understanding that Black feminists talk about the matrix of domination. There are signs, systems, and symbols that allow white supremacy, anti-Blackness, transphobia, transmisogyny, all these things to exist and be omnipresent and rendered invisible at the same time. It is why right now we are still having a conversation about getting at the root cause of anti-Blackness and racism, which requires us to name and acknowledge and fund Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people. That still feels new in this moment by design. What I'm saying is, get out of your own way. Don't spend as much time as you do thinking about what we should be doing on the front end. Trust us, invest in us, and then introduce us to other people so we can do the same with them.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I think that gets back to you, Bree. I'll pivot to you in the spirit of what we know to be true around Black trans lives. And we know how some folks get othered, even by people that look like them, even in their own community, even in our own communities. And the idea that we can look at these numbers and you know, the issues that faced George Floyd or Breonna Taylor are no less less a headline than Tony McDade's killing or other killings that we've witnessed along the way of trans lives that have happened. I live in DC, so we've seen issues of assaults against trans men, trans women in major cities, in suburban cities, in rural towns. We've seen this kind of really disrespect for human life because you don't live or love like them, becoming something that people consider acceptable because of some political or pulpit views that disregard life when people talk about all lives matter, but then they put an asterisk on it. This report, this infographic showed the numbers of the lack of funding for Black trans and gender nonconforming people. Then it also just told the story of the assaults against Black lives. And that's gotta be exhausting. We already consider being Black sometimes walking around with a target on your back, but then being queer or trans and having even maybe 2 targets there is even more exhausting and puts you in that much more jeopardy. Can you really just reconcile for folks here how we need to think differently to really be better allies and partners and supporters of the trans community, the Black trans community, and by extension, other trans communities? You're on mute, I think. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, it's a question for me.
Yes, Bree.
Okay, I'm like, you can't keep making me go after David. I don't know if I can. But no, I think one of the things that I was very clear about is just how much funding trans women of color get from movement. So when we built out Black Trans Fund, I was very clear that as a Black trans woman, that it would seem like that this fund was for Black trans femmes, right? And so explicitly naming who we're for in our mission, so Black trans men, Black trans women, non-binary folks, gender non-conforming folks. And I just wanted to share that a lot of the groups that we have supported, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and transmasculine groups have identified to us that we were the first group that actually funded them and took them seriously, right? And so I wanted to say, like, I think it's important in this moment to fund all Black trans communities, not just Black trans women. I really like this, just get out of your own way, right? And so for me, I think it's important to have a fund like BTF to actually put Black trans folks in leadership, right? So we have an advisory committee of all Black trans folks. So we make the decision. So if I'm unclear about a group, or if I have questions, I go to other Black trans folks to help me make those decisions. And so really encouraging foundations to bring Black trans folks into your funding decisions, right? Pay them to do it, right? Train them up. Because the only way that we're gonna transform philanthropy is to actually have Black trans folks making decisions and actually moving into philanthropy. BTF has a goal of doing that, right? But we're just one institution. What would it look like if we had Black trans folks working at all of the major funds across the country, right? And then the last thing, a lot of our grantees have named for us that this has been a year of tremendous fundraising for their individual organizations. And they have named that with the mutual aid that's going out the door, folks are having a hard time like building capacity in these organizations that are actually providing life-saving work for Black trans communities and move communities into a place where we can organize collectively for liberation, right? And so really wanting to name that, yes, continue to fund groups, right? But I think that there is a level of capacity building that foundations should be funding with groups to make sure that these organizations don't founder after the pandemic is over, knowing that folks Black trans folks were actually living in similar conditions before the pandemic started, right? And these mutual aid programs that like Black trans communities have been running for years are now like the hot thing, right? So once the pandemic is over and folks feel like we're back to normal, air quotes, like what does that mean for resourcing and building capacity in Black trans communities? And I'm telling folks to, in my practice, I feel like resourcing is two-pronged, right? We should be funding groups on the ground directly, and then we should also be thinking about those groups' futures by funding long-term sustainable funds that actually help build capacity and will support them long after the donations that we've given to them on the ground have been spent. And so for us, just really encouraging folks to like give to folks directly and then find intermediaries that fund Black trans communities like the Black Trans Fund, Borealis, Third Wave, all of the good people. Yeah, and to be honest, I really just wanted to name that a lot of the funds that are actually resourcing Black trans communities are smaller funds. Third Wave, Borealis, right? And so we cannot continue to ask small funds to continue to do most of the funding for our movements, right? And so really like thinking about like the work that you're doing and relating it to Black lives and pulling those groups in to help do that work. Black trans communities are doing really amazing work around like feeding folks, reproductive justice, housing folks, criminal justice, protesting, all of the things, right? So we should not just be getting money from LGBT funders and HIV funders.
Can I, Edward, I want to jump in. If this were Instagram, I would double tap that and the heart button. Folks have heard me share my frustration around Bree's Point previously, which is that in 2013, I believe it was, I was announced as the executive director of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans. And a number of friends, including members of the funding community, said to me that they could not wait to fund the work. Within a year, the My Brother's Keeper initiative was announced, and it became the new shiny ball. The title of this portion of the sermon would be "Don't Get Distracted by the Shiny Ball." Because everyone who said that they were excited to continue investing in me and fund the work then held their check because they wanted to use that check to get an invitation to the White House holiday party associated with My Brother's Keeper. Yeah. Now, to be clear, the work of the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for African Americans was about Black folks broadly defined. And so we were intentional in doing work to highlight the intersectional ways in which we show up. We have programming that highlighted the lived experiences of Black students with disabilities, both hidden and visible. We did work and hosted the inaugural White House Summit for African American LGBTQIA+ youth, one of the hardest things that I ever had to do in my life because so many people did not believe in us. And the point I'm making here again is that we still did the work, and part of the work that we did contributed to and is responsible for some of the success of My Brother's Keeper. And there was so much work that we did that wasn't accounted for, wasn't funded or supported by that work that was missed. And so again, I want to encourage folks to not get distracted by the shiny ball. COVID has become a new shiny ball, not because it isn't a global pandemic worthy of our prioritization with regard to attention, but because what it did was invite a lot of funders to send out new invitations to either existing grantees or some did prospective grantees and say, what you gonna do now? Was essentially the question. And the response that I would often provide is we're gonna do the same thing we were doing, in part because we're providing services to people who are living with HIV, who are disproportionately impacted and who are more likely to be susceptible to COVID. We are responding to social justice challenges that are a result of people having housing insecurity, now being harassed because of COVID and these other protocols. We're going to do the same thing we're gonna do before. And in this moment, I need for you not to shift the resources that you said were important to invest in us.
Yeah.
I don't need you to ask me to create a new program or initiative. If you want to do something, double down.
Yes.
Introduce us to another funder.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of shift that I was mentioning earlier and saying to funders, get out of your way. The last thing I'll say is this: I hate the word ally. I hate the word ally, not because it's not foundational in introducing people to the concept that you should be mindful of your privilege, practice what Yolanda Sailor-Ruiz, a professor at Columbia University, calls critical humility, and then shift to action, but because what should be a floor becomes a ceiling. And people are now naming themselves allies when they do these superficial things like donate to HRC. that is important, and it's not enough. Or people watch Will and Grace or RuPaul's Drag Race and can quote the terms, right? Like Black trans folks have been getting their shit stolen for decades. And the point is, those things are important, but they're surface.
Yeah.
I want people to think about, especially funders, to think about the opportunity to shift to being an active accomplice. That's engaging in strategic relationships with us that are cultivated over time. That shows up in the kind of trust that says, like, I believe that you are in a position within your community and within this organization to lead in the way that you see fit. So I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to adjust the ways that we've done this heretofore because that's how it's always been done, and meet you in the middle. And let's co-construct the kinds of reporting requirements, for example, that are needed in order for all of us to feel good about this relationship we're in. That's the kind of shift that is required in order for us to not have to, for me, keep coming back to what feels like circular conversations about root causes when there are solutions we know that should be implemented so we can invest this energy on other seemingly intractable problems.
So I'm not going to go back to Bree, although I have a follow-up question for her. I'm going to go to M on that because you've actually pivoted perfectly, David, to this conversation around solutions. Because we don't want this to be a conversation in which we just talk about the challenges. Oftentimes we know where the challenges are. We know the solutions are, as we tend to say in our Giving Circle world, is time, talent, treasure, and testimony. Everybody can give something. And I think what's become important in this work where philanthropy has not stepped up, we've had folks that have dug into their bosom and their wallets and purses and other ways in which to support movement building, which has always been a part of the work. And so, M, I want to check in on you to talk about this idea of, who are those that are your active accomplices in this work, and that's been really helping to advance this work in spite of the stories and the truth that we're seeing in this infographic.
Yeah. So I think they're like, two sets of folks. So they're the folks that I somewhat lifted up before, which are just the people in the movement, right? And I think we cannot emphasize that enough, the amount of grassroots fundraising, organizing efforts, the amount of regular, everyday people who are invested. And I think if we were somehow able to assess that actual total cost, we would see that, philanthropy pales in comparison to that number. So folks bringing food, just being a staff, never getting paid, but being a staff of, something for years, or folks sharing bus cards, or figuring out creative things around housing, and just a host of other things. And I think it's so important for that to be known and understood by philanthropy, because I think I want philanthropy to understand that, again, the posture we want philanthropy to take is one of camaraderie, of being shoulder to shoulder, and not one that is paternalistic. Is that our investment is actually greater than yours. So this is an invitation for you to join us, not to save us. And so I'm emphasizing that. I want people to understand that. And so that's like the ground, the movement folks. And then there are some folks inside of philanthropy who've been organizing inside of philanthropy that I think have done some things well, or have done things pretty strong. So I think Bree raised up Borealis. I think that they've had a really strong model in terms of how to get resources. So they provide general operating support, which is make it general operating. like give us the resources and allow us to organize. And I know we keep talking about trust, but I also want to point to structure for a second. So I'm all about trust Black women and trust us. I think that that's right. But too often trust is based on interpersonal relationships. And I do not think our liberation should rest on the laurels of if somebody chooses to like me that day. That does not see me in my dignity, and that does not lend me to power by basing it off of your individual sentiments. I want to point to structure for a second, because we have an infographic that says how poorly Black folks are funded. We should have an infographic that says how well white people are funded. And we should have an infographic that shows what the reporting requirements are for those organizations, what their outcomes, what their objectives, how much they got per person, how much they get to spend on each meal. and just, the set of things that we are required to do. And I think structurally right there, we'll see the structural disparities. We'll see the way that anti-Blackness, anti-queer, anti-trans, anti-woman, et cetera-ness shows up inside of philanthropy. But continuing on that, what I'm getting at is general operating support. I think we know how to build movement. If that's not evidenced now, I challenge folks to find a movement as robust as ours. You know what I mean? Like if we have not evidenced the power of Black movement across sectors, across historic periods of folks, then then I don't know where you've been. You know what I mean? So I think we demonstrated that. I think one of the things that Borealis also does is not only do they give general operating support, but one of their particular funds, TMF, gives support for organizational development and gives support for leadership development. So I can say that was the first time that I actually got grant money that was specifically about developing my leadership. That was the first time that I got to get a coach. That was the first time that I got to say, oh, I'm going to study this particular set of political questions with these folks and create time and have resource for it. So I think those sorts of approaches are really, really important. I also just think there's tons of incredible individuals. I think about Tanisha McCarris, who was at Novo, and boo for them cutting that, Novo money out. But I think about Tanisha McCarris, I think about Ramatu, I think about Julia Beatty at Boreal. There's just so many, I think, folks I can, chat, put in the list, who I think really understand movement and who see their role as being comrades, who see themselves as having a role in movement to organize resources toward movement, and who see that job as fulfilling that mission and not as a job that's just seeking to check off of a bunch of boxes. And so lastly, the thing that I'll say is, I hear funders talk about they're not sure and I don't know. And at this point, I'm just not clear about what they're unsure about or what they don't know. I think it's simple. I think the thing you should do is fund Black trans people. I think that's probably the easiest box you can come up with. Is this a Black, this is a Black queer-led organization? Check, yes, fund. Like, I think it's just so, it's not that, so at some point I'm challenging this, I don't know, we don't know question, because I think so much has been offered to try to answer that. And so my challenge question is, then what is the real issue?
Listen, wait, Edward, before you, don't commit yet, because I want to double tap. It was graceful and everything that they said. And again, always love whatever I could just soak it up, take all the money to the offering. I want to go back to a point that April made early on and highlight that there are still too many funders that fund the same partners, including legacy civil rights organizations, expecting for them to do things that benefit or at least acknowledge Black, queer, trans, and non-binary people when they don't. And there's no data around what they're doing. There's no accountability expectations. It is often a blank check. And I would much rather you simply say that we are investing in this way out of guilt, out of lack of whatever, than continue to purport to say that you care about the liberation of Black, queer, trans, non-binary, intersex folk and give to people who yield the same results. So I just want to name a thing, and also acknowledge that is a problem in this space as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's a charge, and I'll look to my colleagues at funders, because one of the things you mentioned in our conversation yesterday, actually, April, was the idea that you all have been doing these comparative studies, this work for like 10 years. So the trending, the trending data that you've been pulling for the past 10 years. And so I think it's an important reference when we're talking about this particular issue as it relates to folks benchmarking. Philanthropy likes to benchmark. So where are we today should not be the same place as we are tomorrow. And the importance of that data that was showing this rise in LGBTQ funding, but really, if you looked at Black LGBTQ funding, we so much less. I think those are the kinds of stories that people need to hear, and not hear just for the sake of saying, oh, that's really powerful information. Now what I'm going to do with what I know, because you can't unring these proverbial bells, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And then I'm going to go back to another question. And I do want to ask Bree something before we open up for other questions in the room. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Totally. I think the fact that we have been tracking this data so long, and we I can speak broadly, right? We've been waiting for that $200 million number to come out for so long. That was something that when we were writing the tracking report last year, it was like, are we going to do it? Is this finally going to happen? And it's something that has come up with small incremental change over time. And that's something, but it's not enough, right? We need large scale change, especially when we talk about funding for Black LGBTQ communities. $7.5 million is not enough. 0.01% of all foundation funding is not enough. These numbers are not enough. And so I think when people look at this infographic, we have laid out opportunities. These opportunities that we've laid out are not revolutionary in any way. They're pretty basic. They're bare bones, right? It's stuff like center Black trans experience. Like, I shouldn't have to tell you that. You should know that. But what this infographic can offer is a chance for you, if you did not know that, to know that. And if you did know that, but you need a reminder, to have that reminder. Our hope with this is that people engage with this infographic and they engage with it to really make the sustained change that we hear that people want to make all the time. But words are not action. Action is action. And we need people to take up that action. And so I know that funders is committed to looking at people making this action, and in that way, in the way that data can, because data can only do so much, right? Like, if I put this data out here and you look at it, if you don't, you don't, but data can only do so much. We want to hold people accountable by looking at the data over time. And when we look back at this next year, we don't want it to say the same thing.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you for that. And some folks that are on this call or that will hear this recording are the ones that can help make sure the data looks better next time you do the report, right?
Yes.
I want to come back to you, Bree. I gave you that space between you and David, just intentionally, kind of. But the idea is, I would pick up on something that actually is even more timely now, because Em talked about the idea of supporting leaders and supporting leadership and giving, Black-led leadership the resources that they need, not only just for leading, but also part of that leading support also means support for rest, for wellness and the like. And Bree, you've been a part of a couple of fellowships. You're kind of fellowshipped in this particular fund to help incubate this work. And we talk a lot in these spaces around incubation. We get to talk about supporting, emerging businesses and other groups. And folks are very quick to put money towards supporting Black entrepreneurs, for example, or small businesses and the like. But small and emerging funding groups, small and emerging nonprofits, Black-led, trans-led, what have you, they need support too. And they need that kind of intentional support. So most all of us are working from home in some way, but we still need ways in which we can be strengthened to get the things that we need done, whether it's Wi-Fi or, the tools that we need for our connections. And you've been a beneficiary, Bree, of that type of support by being in these fellowships. You were just in a fellowship, I think a couple of years ago, with Gabriel Foster, who is an alum of our fellowship program. I want to give Gabriel a shout out for the Trans Justice Funding Project. But can you talk a little bit about how these relationships have, what they've meant to you in your work? And are you still there, Bree? Because I think I lost you. Bree, are you there? As I just say that, we may have lost Bree. We'll come back to that. I want to pose a question to all of you that came up in the chat, and it was thanks to you, Victoria, whom I had the pleasure of meeting a few years ago. And so it's good to see you. I'm glad you're working with that powerhouse, David, now. This question I think is an important one, so I'm going to read it. Matter of fact, I should have let you go in and read it, Victoria, if you could unmute yourself, because I think it's an important one. And it's the one around the
reconciliation.
moment.
Yes. Over the summer, there were moments where I was inspired in ways that I can't remember feeling in my lifetime so far, just in terms of folks across the country who finally were awakened to hear and not to just stay in a place of being triggered on both sides, right? Meaning people of color and also white folks. and there was an authenticity that is often missing from some of the responses to protests that we've seen in past years. So I do think there is a moment right now, especially with the percentage of folks who came to the polls because of racial inequity, and having the and data to back that up, to support how Biden Harris, won the election. And so I think there's a moment right now around reconciliation and hopefully reparations, but definitely around reconciliation, for folks to have honest conversations so we can get out of having the same kind of surface recycling over and over again stuff because people refuse to go deep and do their personal work, but to have some real deep across the country, across all the different communities, conversations that lead to action, around racial inequity, which includes LGBTQ folks. And so I put it a little bit more succinctly in the chat, but I'm curious, for the different organizations represented in the panel, how are you all thinking about approaching this particular moment around reconciliation and the opportunity to move legislation? And how should funders be approaching this particular moment? Because it's a moment that won't give folks the quick transactional, I gave you, $5 million, what you do with it in a year kind of moment. It's a moment where if it's done right, will yield us benefits for centuries to come. And if it's wasted, well, it's wasted.
Victoria, thank you for that. David and M, I think Bree's trying to get back with us, but are you there, Bree?
I am. I'm sorry, y'all. My internet is anti-Black and transphobic at the moment, but I'm here.
I understand. You're there. I don't know if you heard Victoria's question, but I want to come back to you on something else. But I'm going to let David and M answer this last piece from Victoria. It's an important one because this is a moment that got longer implications if it really is going to be a movement, right? David and M. He's deferring to you, M. So why don't you start, and then he'll do his thing.
Right on. So I think, thank you for that question. That's an important question. A few quick thoughts. Yes, I think that work around reparations has reached a particular kind of popularity that's exciting, juicy, and inspiring. And that's, decades of work, centuries actually, but decades at least, thinking back to the 20s around Queen Mother Moore, but that's just, a lot of work that's gotten us to this point. And so for folks who want to dig in, learn more about what that can look like, Movement for Black Lives has an entire reparations section in our policy platform, Vision for Black Lives. So what I think philanthropy can do is a couple of things. So one, reparations is not a one-off thing, right? Reparations requires structural shift and an acknowledgement of harm. I mean, it's an entire framework. But on pathway to reparations, there is wealth transfer, right? There's wealth transfer and political analysis building. And this is the moment where I think philanthropy can do a lot of work. So one of the things that philanthropy can do is give equitably to Black organizations, right? And so that is a lot of these conversations right now. It's giving people the appropriate amount of resource it actually takes to do the work. It is also, I think, being creative or allowing for folks to do things that other historically white organizations can do. Give us some money to build an endowment, right? Give us some money to actually have an organizational savings. Give us enough money where we can ensure that trans, GNC, and intersex folks have excellent healthcare at our organizations. Give us enough money so that, we not run into a cash flow issue come 3 months before the year ends, right? So I think about how to philanthropy seriously giving equitably to resource or to get organizations to a place where we will be resourced similarly with parity, et cetera, as other white, longer historic institutions. And our organizations just have not done that, frankly. I also think about, and this is maybe the question that you were gonna bring up to Bree, but I also think about philanthropy should be, giving people, helping create these robust fellowships where people can actually have meaningful sabbaticals, right? Enough money where you can actually be off, live, be okay, but actually rest, right? Like that's part of it, right? Is if we're enduring this undue harm, undue burden, that is causing us health issues, right? So how does philanthropy actually step up and allow folks to rest? And I also think, how does philanthropy do a bunch of creative things, right? So what we also know is that because of anti-Blackness, anti-transness, et cetera, you know, and capitalism, many Black, trans, GNC, intersex organizations really rely on the few people inside of them to keep them going, right? Like they don't have the same sort of opportunities to build the infrastructure, et cetera. So I even think about for folks who are, I even think about like, how do we resource individuals directly? Like there is no reason, and I'm gonna just be direct, there's no reason why Miss Major still needs that Fund Me, Care Me page. How can you fucking be, excuse me, I'm speaking, you know, excuse my swear word, but how can you be Miss Major and have given movement so much, and still be looking for help to pay your rent? This is what I mean. Philanthropy should have a fellowship. I mean, I don't know what to call it, but you know, for folks who've just been building movement, who've built organizations, who've seeded moments, who've seeded entire political frameworks, who have raised up generations of folks, people, Barbara of the Combahee River Collective, there's no way she should be having a Care for Me page. She should be okay, right? So those are some of the things that I'm also thinking about that are not exactly reparations, but part of the wealth redistribution as we're building to the structural reparations.
A movement retirement plan with support that's funded. Yes, indeed. David, your thoughts, and I want to really give some time for Bree because I want to come back to this leadership question too.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. Although you know that's a challenge to me. That's not my ministry. Agree with what Em said in investing equitably, right? I don't want equal. I want equity in the terms like, you know, Rihanna, pay me what you owe me. Beyonce, pay me in equity. So definitely double tap all of that. What we will do as an organization to respond to Victoria's question is the same thing we've always been doing. We will focus on narrative shift. I dropped a resource in the chat for our Inviting In toolkit. Inviting it as a concept that troubles this idea of coming out. Coming out, I believe, I know is something that privileged white people get to do when they come out to their families. They move to neighborhoods like Hollywood, California, Chelsea, New York, Boys Town, Chicago, get to join Stonewall associations and draw power from that part of their identity. We often don't have that luxury. We live with other Black people. We are disproportionately concentrated in states where it's still legal to deny us access to public accommodations. This while the white LGBTQ movement is celebrating the Title VII win, which doesn't mean anything if you're a Black trans woman and can't get clothes for the job, showing up in ways that you're expected, or access public housing, just to name a few. And so narrative shift will continue to be a focus. To M's point about succession planning and wellness, we will continue to support pipeline development and double down on our work around cultural competence and shifting praxis as it relates to children, youth, and young adults. So we do a lot of work in that space, both in the K-12 space as well as in the post-secondary space, focused on HBCUs, which we think will become increasingly more important as people are seeking ways to being anti-racist and the other things that are important. And then the last thing, if we were in a physical space, I would invite Victoria to speak to this. This is why we invested in her leadership. We'll continue to double down on our advocacy and action plan. There are a number of legislative proposals that supplement what Em mentioned with regard to addressing reparations, 2 bills in particular that have been introduced by Congresswoman Barbara Lee, as well as Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. Those will be a part of our robust policy agenda, which we will continue to implement and work in partnership with organizations and entities like the Movement for Black Lives to ensure passage, not only at a federal level, but locally where and how appropriate.
Thank you for that. And it's hard to believe that this time is almost done, but that means it's just been that rich and just fulfilling. And Bree, I'm glad to have you back because what I had talked about earlier was this notion, and you lifted up the fellowship and how that's been another way of engagement. And it goes back to something David said earlier, this notion of being radical, funding radically, thinking about other ways in which to support organizations such as leadership development and the like. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit about how, you know, your experiences in these fellowships that have really helped you and give you a space to thrive and do the work that's important to you and so many others. Talk a little bit about that real quick, and then we'll have to wrap.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. To be honest, a lot of the fellowships that I had participated in weren't actually really fruitful for me.
And I will name that because I do think that there is a disconnect as to what interventions or activities on the ground move, how they move differently for other communities versus like Black trans communities. So to me, I felt like a lot of my leadership development was, I'm trying to create something new. And to me, it felt like a lot of those leadership developments were trying to teach me like the old school ways of doing things, which I feel like are harmful. I will say that my leadership in the last couple of years has been really like cultivated and held in a way that I haven't experienced in my life. And it's to the staff at Groundswell. Not only was I able to like create a fund, Groundswell like supports that fund like financially and through like other ways throughout the organization, but it feels refreshing to actually be in this place of like I'm leading, but I'm also learning. And in that learning, I think one of the things that has helped me kind of stay grounded and actually help me move this actual fund is being able to work with a group of people that I can tell them that things aren't working. And folks trust me and we like figure it out together. A big piece of my proudest moment this year was to be able to move $20,000 grants to organizations and pay their fiscal fees. And so when I brought that up, folks didn't tell me no. Folks told me that other folks hadn't like done that before and how daunting of a task that it could be. But when I told folks about like how important that was to me and how in my politics, I'm a firm believer that if I'm saying that I'm giving you a 15K grant, like I should be giving you all of that, right? And yeah, and so for me, I feel like the most memorable parts of my leadership were where folks actually like saw me and saw the work that I was trying to do and supported that vision and made it happen, despite obstacles, concerns, optics. And I am very clear that I've been blessed with like these leadership opportunities. So like, what is my duty as a grant maker, right? To also like help build the leadership of Black trans communities. And so many Black trans communities have built my own personal leadership too. I was gonna say it's kind of a payback. It's not that, right? I also wanna name too that like I feel like one of the things that I would like for philanthropy to think a little bit more deeply about is how we talk about our grantees. There are tons of organizations that refer to their grantees as grant partners, and being very clear about what a partnership means, right? So for me, we don't name our grantees partners because we have not developed relationships with them in a way to consider them partners. That's something that we're doing, right? But we're not there. And so for me, like really wanting folks in philanthropy to like recognize that a $20,000 grant isn't a partnership, right? Funding folks while looking for the next shiny thing is not a real partnership, right? And then actually like taking away or reducing the amount of resources to organizations is not a partnership, right? And so for me, I've always felt like my leadership has been very thoughtful around partnerships, right? Like how do I do really great work and bring folks along with me? And so that is exactly what I'm trying to do with BTF. Not just giving folks grants, but like capacity building. I spend a lot of time on phones, talking to groups, helping them build out programming, evaluation, right? And so knowing that not all of philanthropy has that type of capacity or that type of like love and honor for communities. But it's to me, reminds me of like all of the time and energy and effort that like folks who like saw me and saw something like great and like wanted to invest in that. And so it's my gift back to communities to be able to resource folks in this way.
Thank you, Bree. I appreciate this. I know we are at time. I know we started a little bit late. We're at time for this, but I've already been asked, will there be a part 2 of this conversation? So we'll need to talk about that. I wanted to give our colleague, our partner, April, the last word after asking the speakers if there's one more, if you'd say what should be the next step for philanthropy in this conversation as some marching orders. Victoria, you have captured some great stuff in here. And so I'm gonna look to you being my wing person in these spaces and invite everyone to save the chat because this is some rich information in there from everyone. But marching orders, let's start with you, David, then M, and then Bree. Final marching orders for philanthropy.
I was writing in the chat that you can't be offering up labor for Victoria. We got a whole agenda we about to move. So unless that comes with a grant, some general operating support, and that's with this infrastructure, we're gonna have to talk through that. Just want to put that out there. I would invite everyone who's interested in this to sit down with us so we can have a more thoughtful conversation about what's required to develop the kind of relationship that will result in the partnership that Bree described. There's so much more that we could talk about. I just want to say thank you to everyone that thought it important to give it their time to engage with us either in real time or on demand later. And really want to say thank you to M and to Bree for the way that you always show up for and in our community. And thank you to you, April, and your team, and you, Edward, and the crew for all that you do. Please give Susan my best as well.
Thank you. M.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. And just, you know, I'm a fan of the folks I'm on the panel with, so it's good to be with them. But again, fund us like you want us to win. I think this historic moment really reveals the power of Black organizing, Black queer trans organizing, where we have produced a historic on the ground movement that's been the largest movement in recent decades, where we have turned red states blue, where we have advanced narratives and just done all the things that movement seeks to do. I think is evidence of why philanthropy needs to dig deep and to pay out. And so fund us like you want us to win.
Thank you, thank you. Bree, and then you'll wrap us up, April. You're on mute, Bree.
I wanted to come on video because I wanted to share something with you all. Folks in community lost a pioneer, Monica Roberts. And so my call to philanthropy is actually for us to take some time during this month, during the month of Trans Day of Remembrance, to not only speak the names and talk about the legacies of tons of trans folks that we've lost over the years, right? But like actually putting resources into that memory. I know that there are tons of folks in Texas right now who are grieving at the loss of Monica. Particularly, I'm thinking of Miss Dee Dee Waters. So really wanting folks in philanthropy to just be thoughtful about what's happening on the ground and to support folks, particularly at this moment, asking for folks to support Black trans-led organizations and leaders in Texas as folks deal with the death of Monica Roberts.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much. April.
Thank you so much, all of you. This was incredible, and I'm so glad to have been a part of this conversation. I guess my final word for this, that's too much pressure, Edward, but my final word for this is lean on your PSOs, right? Like AbbVie's here, Funders is here. We produce this data, but we don't just produce this data to be one and done, to look at this, to look at our infographic and that to be it. We want to we're here to support you. We're here to support you to give better, and in this case, to give more to LGBTQ Black communities. And we have movement leaders here who are incredible. And I know that one phrase that has been brought up by them is dancing for peanuts. We don't want them to have to dance for peanuts. And your PSOs are here, so they don't have to dance for peanuts. Like, please come to us. You pay your dues, and that's what we're here for. So I'm gonna leave it at that. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. And yes, thanks for folks sticking with this conversation. And we know this won't be the last time we have not just a discussion, but as we're looking at what has been shared, the truths that have been shared, it's up to us to now act on those truths. I always say you can't, once you hear this information, you can't unring these bells. And so if you are willfully ignoring this, then it's shame on you. But you've heard what we need to do. You've gotten guidance on how to do it, and now you know more people who are doing it, doing the work and putting the work in. Fund them like you want them to win, and so that we don't have to come back again and looking at another infographic that just shows the inequities. We've got work to do, and one election does not end it all. So let's keep thinking about what's the next victory. Georgia, let's think about how we're going to start moving and making some actions that are going to really move and help all of us so that we are all winning. Thank you all for being part of this. On behalf of AFTI and our partners here with Funders for LGBTQ Issues, and keep thriving, and let's keep working. Be well.
Thank y'all.
Take care.
Bye.